Listen, I asked one of my favorite booktubers, Library of a Viking, to come help us craft the ultimate fantasy book recommendations list because today we're going to be seeing 15 fantasy reads ranging from beginner to intermediate to advanced. And the cool thing about it is that both Johan and I, we read slightly different types of books. So hopefully here you can find a little bit of something and hopefully your next 5-star read. And before we start, Johan, how are we doing?
Yeah, really well. I'm really excited. Thank you for having me.
Let's start, if you will, with some beginner reads. And I wanted to start with Neil Gaiman, who is very iconic. I started with Stardust. It's a great book because it just blends so many fantasy elements that I consider to be classic fantasy, right? We will have The Chosen One, a Misfit, we will have Portal Fantasy, but also trials, witches, pirates. There are so many things in just so little pages, which makes it incredibly accessible. Also, I think that Neil Gaiman just has something, everything seems so vivid to me, and I really believe that it has this whimsy that you can associate with fantasy.
Absolutely, yeah. I think Stardust is a great recommendation for beginners, but for me, I was slightly disappointed with it actually when I read it. But it's a
No.
very an accessible read, and the story is easy to follow. So yeah, definitely, if you're a beginner, then I think Stardust is a great place to start.
What else do you believe?
The book I would recommend if you're new to fantasy is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. I mean, this book was literally written for children initially, and everyone knows the story. You've probably seen the movies, which also makes it a bit easier to follow. And the writing style
Mhm.
is great, and I mean, the characters in this book are so fun. And yeah, it's just an overall wonderful introduction because you have really, really great world building. You have a wonderful adventure, and if you enjoy this, then you can potentially pick up Lord of the Rings, which is a bit of a step up in like prose and world building and so on. But yeah, you can't really go wrong with The Hobbit. It's such an iconic novel and definitely a must read for fantasy fans.
Absolutely agreed. I wanted to also bring here a little bit of young adult
Mm.
story, and we have Six of Crows. The great thing about this duology is that one, it leans a little bit more younger. So if you are really, really new to fantasy, or if you enjoy those kind of reads, I think it's great to start. It doesn't have lots of fantasy elements, mainly the magic. It's kind of like really low, but there are different points of view. Six, we have a high study score, gray characters, which I thought is also very interesting to start getting, the gist of more complex characters. And, there's a little bit of romance, but the characters are just so nuanced. There's nothing easy. And it's a story that overall will make you suffer slightly. The stakes are high for these crowds. And I reckon with the TV series also, it's way more accessible to get into this because you already, if you watch it, you already know some of these characters, but the story is still to be told.
Well, the fourth recommendation, and you probably know what's going to come next, The Final Empire or the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon
Yay!
Sanderson. This book is probably on every single beginner's guide to fantasy video on booktube, but it is for a good reason because the writing style is so accessible and the magic system is so fascinating, and there's just something so satisfying with seeing a group of like misfits coming together and try to pull off something impossible, which is very much the Final Empire. And I also think this is a great book if you're like new to fantasy and you want to read something more of the modern fantasy, because Henderson, he does put some interesting twists on some of the tropes we have come to know and love. So yeah, this is a very solid recommendation, and there's two other books in this series. They're all wonderful, so yeah, you can't really go wrong with Brandon Sanderson.
Sanderson in here explains the elemency so good, and it
Yeah,
just resembles something like science, and it's very interesting. It's one of the best magic systems that I've read in
absolutely.
this
And
lifetime.
the way most people describe it, and I would agree, is that Sanderson has a very cinematic kind of writing
Mhm.
style. It almost feels
Absolutely.
like reading a video game or watching a movie when you read this book. So it really helps you to get so immersed. So yeah, even just from the very first, like the prologue is so
Yes.
atmospheric, and yeah, it's just
Yeah.
wonderful. I love the series, and one of the series that actually got me into fantasy. So it does also have some
Same.
nostalgic value for me.
No, no, absolutely same. Speaking of Sanderson completely, we also wanted to share Warbreaker. At the moment, Wordbreaker it's a standalone, which I think it's a great thing also if you're starting with fantasy because the commitment, it's not super high. In here, we'll have first a story that it's blending religion, politics, a little bit of romance. You will have lots of adventure and different points of view. So it's something that it's a slightly more rich, but it's still it reads very easily. The setting it's very vivid. The magic here it's based on breads, but you see colors all over the place. So it's something that it's really beautiful to read. And for me, this is one of the books that I think are more hilarious because one of the points of view it's super
Yeah, it's
funny.
a great recommendation.
Also, there's a sentient sword. Like, what can go wrong with the sentient sword that wants
Absolutely.
to kill? There's nothing wrong. Lovely. So maybe we should be leaning a little bit more towards the intermediate reads, right? Like something that it's a little bit more advanced in
Mm.
some way or form, and maybe you can tell us why.
So, if you don't want to read a beginner's fantasy, but you want to something that is a bit more challenging, I think most of, maybe all of John Gwynn's books are a great recommendation. And this is Malice, the first book in the Faithful and the Fallen quartet. I would say maybe this isn't the best book in the series, but what I just loved about the series is that the pacing is absolutely ruthless, especially when you get to the midpoint of this book. It just never stops. Like the pacing just it's breakneck. There are so many satisfying twists and turns, and this is a classic fantasy, but it does have that modern feel to it. So the characters are maybe a bit more realized. As I said, the pacing is great. The writing style is also quite accessible, and especially book 2 and 3 in the series are amazing. One of my favorite books in the series, for sure. It does have a bit more complexity than some of the other books we mentioned. We have more POVs, more characters for sure, but it does still have that good versus evil kind of vibe, but does
Yeah.
have some interesting twists on it as well. So yeah, can't really go wrong with John Gwynn.
Okay, you convinced me this is gonna be my next read.
Yes.
And I had something slightly different here with the Founders Trilogy by Robert Jackson Bennett. I've placed this book here because even if it is young adult, it definitely leans a little bit more older. And it's a story that, even if it starts with a high study score, I think that both the magic system and also how this story progresses towards a sci-fi story makes it a little bit more complex to follow. Really not much, and it's fascinating to read, honestly. In this world, they've kind of like discovered that they can inscribe objects and those objects can be commanded. So there's also kind of like this scientific approach to the magic, and it's something that is taken care almost as if it were intellectual property. And the characters are really nuanced. Everything happens so fast and the stakes start really being high, but in book 2 they're just like way more, and book 3 is like, okay, everything is gonna end. So it's a fantastic book. It is really, really fast paced.
Yeah, and I feel bad. I haven't read anything by that author yet, and people keep talking about he's so underrated. So, yeah.
Agreed.
So the third recommendation in the intermediate is the Winry Flame trilogy by
Yay!
Jen Williams. Now this is very different from I think anything we recommended yet. The reason why it's here is because well the writing style is accessible, but this is a very good example of a modern fantasy. Because this is not a medieval fantasy, and this one gets seriously strange. I mean, you have witches that rides on large bats. You have this alien race that drinks human blood. You have like these UFOs scattered around the world. There are so many things that are so weird about this one. But I think that's the reason why I love it so much because it is strange. It feels different. It feels fresh. And also the pacing is wonderful. Even if you're a beginner, I think maybe some of you could enjoy this one as well. But it does have a bit more complexity to it as well. And especially the world building can be a bit weird. And maybe you have to get your head around it. But yeah, it's definitely a very fresh fantasy. So if you want something fresh, pick up the Winter Flame trilogy. Like, you can't really go wrong with it. And also, these covers are really, really cool.
I really agree with what you say, and I loved this trilogy. The only thing that I would say is that they are way more character driven to what I was expecting at the beginning. Like the character work, it's deep, and especially the first book, as you were saying, you don't have a clue what is happening. So you need to have a little bit of patience to understand what is happening and, placing all these pieces together.
Absolutely. And to this day, I still think this has some of the best animal pet companions I've ever come
Oh
across in
yes.
fantasy, especially from
Oh
book
yeah.
2 and 3. They just become so good. So, yeah.
And talking about animal companions, I
Mm.
think one of the best trilogies that I've read, I am so absolutely in love with these. It's The Drowning Empire by Andrea Stewart. It's here because it has a bigger scope, right? Like we will follow these different perspectives. In the first book, I believe there are kind of like five, and then we'll narrow that down a little bit, which is not going to be as overwhelming, but the story is just placed around this whole land. There are kind of like different lines happening separately, and it's also kind of like a blend between fantasy and horror in this case. So there's a unique setting here, especially a thing that I loved. It's the magic. It's again a hot magic system. We see how they have these festival where they are able to extract bones from people, inscribe them, and then put these bones together in creatures and command those constructs. But these constructs are sucking the life of the people. And, people is not happy about it. And the story unfolds, but it is really, really great. There are politics, there are moments that are really dark, and I,
Mm.
I just really enjoyed it.
Yeah. I actually read the first book 18 months
Yay!
ago, but I didn't really enjoy it that much. It's
No!
weird because I feel like that is a book I should have absolutely loved, but I
Yeah.
did have a similar experience with The Ninth Reign. When the first time I read it, I didn't enjoy it, but I just felt like this was a book I was supposed to love, and then I reread it and I loved it. So actually, I am hoping to reread. So the fifth recommendation in Intermediate is the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb. Now, the reason why this isn't in the beginning is because most of you may probably know this is a singular plotline. You're following a first person point of view, which is Fitz, throughout this whole trilogy. So it's not complex in the way that you have many POVs, and the world building isn't even that complex. But what I would say here is the writing style is it's very, very beautiful, but if you're not an avid reader, then maybe the prose can be a bit of a challenge, and then the pacing is very, very slow. But
Very
the
slow.
reason why I love this one is because this is one of the best character studies I've ever come across in fantasy. Robin Hobb, she just seems to understand humans so well. And in this series, we follow a royal bastard that he just feels so out of place in this world. And just analysis of identity and identity struggles and finding your place in the world is masterfully handled. And the world building is pretty, pretty great. And really, just the characters, the characterizations in this trilogy is so, so good. And the first book isn't that long, but book 2 and 3 they get seriously chunky. So yeah, you have to invest a bit of time into it. But yeah, if you want a first-person point of view character study kind of novel that has some really great animal companions and, as I said, amazing analysis of identity, especially and grief and loss and stuff like that, definitely one out. You'll probably cry, but it's gonna be worth it.
I was hoping for you to bring the Life Shape trilogy here, or
Oh,
maybe.
that is also just read all of Robin Hobb's books.
Well, let's move to more advanced reads, right? And in here, we are not expecting you to not read these books if you feel that it's something that you enjoy. So even if you are a beginner, if something around these lines sounds good to you, definitely give it a go. It seems that are more complex in terms of points of view of the story or the commitment, but everything is accessible to everyone. So tell us, Johan, what
Yes.
is the first book that you have here?
So all of these recommendations are going to be seriously epic. The shortest series on my recommendations is an 8-book series, but the first one, and if you watch my channel, this will not come as a surprise to you, but that is The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. If you're looking for something seriously epic, this is a 14-book epic series. It does also have a prequel novel. They're probably the average page count is around 800 pages. So yeah, it's like 12,000 pages, this whole series. If you want a series that is, like, the world building is so rich, but you have so many different cultures, and the cast, I think there's more than 2,000 character names mentioned in this whole series. The scope of this novel is absolutely insane. But it is definitely a very classic fantasy in the beginning, and this series has some of the best magic I've ever come across yet. The world building is wonderful, and the characters can be infuriating at times, but the character arcs from book 1 to book 14, believe me, when you get to book 14 and you see how these characters have evolved, like, it will make you emotional. But if you want something seriously epic, then definitely check out The Wheel of Time.
Please do, as well as Johan's channel. Please subscribe to his channel. He is amazing. So please do. Yeah, I wanted to continue with something that can also go to the intermediate side, but I added it here because I think it's very complicated to connect with a character, and that is the Poppy War. This trilogy, it's something unique. I believe that Erev Kwang has this ability of making you angry and to make you feel really intense emotions, and to me those emotions tend to be on the negative side. Like I really wanted to forget everything that was happening here. This is a very war strategic driven book, and it's not for everyone. It starts in a way that it seems that it was going to be way more accessible, and I was very into it, but then it just, a war starts to unfold and everyone will need to play a role within this war, and it is really around that war, about the very complex decisions that we need to make. And even if we will mainly follow one point of view, I feel that we will get to know other characters fairly well. Everything that happens, it's just so massive, it's very dark, and it is very complex to connect with this character. So if you continue, you're continuing because the story is very good, but not because it is necessarily easy to read them. And that's
Yeah.
why it is here for
And
me.
I think the first book is definitely the easiest one to get into, but
Yeah.
book 2 and 3 definitely become more like warfare, strategic warfare
Hmm.
focused. So yeah, I totally get that. And yeah, it's definitely grimdark from book 2 onwards for sure. All
Agreed.
right, the third one, and I actually don't have a physical copy with me, but that is The Gunslinger. Isa, you can put it here. By Stephen King, or the first book in the Dark Tower series, probably my favorite series of all time. And the reason why I put it in the advanced section is because this series is seriously weird and complex. You have world hopping, you have a lot of meta elements. It gets so ridiculously weird in book 5, 6, and 7. But what I love about this series is that every single book, and there are 8 books in total, they feel so different from each other. Like the first one is a dystopian western kind of book, and then book 2 is a like a really strange world hopping kind of novel, and then book 3 is a more like a epic fantasy kind of novel, and so on and so on. And Roland, who is the protagonist, is one of the most iconic characters I've ever come across in fantasy. I mean, he is just, I just love Roland for like he's so mysterious, and yeah, he's a wonderful character, and just the sheer audacity of writing a fantasy series like this is just mind blowing. It's one of the most ambitious works I've come across, and it will not work for everyone because it's so ridiculously weird. But yeah, it's definitely worth checking out. I think if you're looking for something that is gonna challenge you a bit and it's gonna be a bit different from your typical farm boy to hero kind of story.
Okay. I'm intrigued though. I'm very intrigued. Okay. I'm feeling super blessed that the next book that we have to explain, and I got that, is Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. It is really accessible. Like the writing style will remain in line with what we've described before. So it's still something that it's fairly info dumpy that will, get your interest real soon. But in here we have way more points of view. The characterization, it's done in a way that to me it's way more character driven to what we see in other books. And there's also lots of politics. The magic system, it's not as easy to grasp as we have in other books. You do need to read in order to understand, and the first book, for the majority of the time, you're still trying to understand what happens. Also, Sanderson created something masterfully with these. Like, he pays attention to the world, to the fauna, to the flora, everything is crafted anew. We will have different species, a war at its core, and I'm so fascinated about this book, about this series. But it is a commitment. Let's talk about that, because every book is chunky, and we will have 10 books, and out of those only 4 are out already. So it's something that you need to understand, that this is a ride and that it will take a little bit of time.
Yeah,
But otherwise phenomenal. Do you agree?
I definitely agree. I'll only read the first 2 books yet, but what I read I've absolutely loved, and it's kind of like Mistborn, but just way more complex.
Yeah.
So definitely, if you love like the Mistborn trilogy, then the Stormlight Archive is gonna be absolutely perfect for you.
Yeah. I think also that they are elements in terms of the magic that are blended. Like we will have discussions with these almost gods. So it's very interesting, and the characters, they are unforgettable. Just
They are wonderful characters.
and
All
what
right.
is the book that you suggest we end with?
So this one is not a book or series that I personally love, but when we are talking about advanced fantasy, we have to talk about Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. The initial series is a 10-book series, and these are also seriously chunky books, around 800 to 1,000 page per book. And I'm telling you guys, I've never read anything as complex as the Malazan series. I can't even begin to describe the experience of reading the series, but what I'll say here is that the people that love Malazan, they don't only love it, they say it's one of the best works of literature ever. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked that well for me, but if you want a world building that is on a whole another level, you literally have hundreds of thousands of years of history here. This series spans over 3 different, not countries, but continents. The scale of this series is insane. I've never come across anything like it. So if you want to be challenged, if you want to read something that you've never read in the fantasy genre before, then definitely check out the Malazan Book of the Fallen. It is different, but it's definitely advanced.
Man, I want to give it a try, but at the same time, I don't want to feel disappointed about not liking it. Like I like the idea of me liking it potentially, not facing
Yeah.
the reality.
You have to be okay with being confused when you're reading the series because so many things happen here that you just literally have no idea why.
Okay, so these were the 15 fantasy books that we hope are perfect for you, either if you are studying, you're a little bit more seasoned, or if you are really an advanced fantasy reader. Let us know down below what are other books that you might enjoy or that you would recommend other people. Don't forget to check Johan's channel in case you haven't already, and let's see each other soon. Bye!
Thank you so much for having me.